Welcome to the Infernal Brotherhood's Willow series. Today I'm continuing my live reading of Shadow Moon by Chris Claremont and George Lucas, Book 1 of the Chronicles of the Shadow War trilogy. If you enjoy this series, please like, share, and subscribe for more Willow content. You can also support us by becoming a patron on Patreon or a member here on YouTube. It really helps the channel grow. You can even help us out by signing up to Audible by using the link in the description below. Garen's right about the silence, he thought, as he tried to find even a semblance of beauty in the perpetual twilight. He had walked such stands as these often. Sherlindria planted them where she pleased, and they flourished in spite of local conditions. Normally there was a humid warmth in the groves as the sun warmed the air beneath the overhanging canopy, which in turn prevented it from slipping away as day progressed towards nightfall. In addition, heat was given off by the decaying matter scattered across the floor, everything from fallen leaves to fallen logs. Sound carried a goodly distance, and it wasn't uncommon, if a visitor walked with care, to hear evidence of the creatures who dwelled within. Many was the night when sprites and sprites themselves would come to visit, drawn to his power as a moth to a candle flame. He danced his share of their circle, helped them be born, and helped them gently die. These were among his favorite places, because in the atmosphere they most reminded him of home. They were places where he felt at peace, finding a simple joy that brought renewal to his soul as the rest restored his body. Here, though, he found desolation, a semblance of what was, form without substance. To the surface eye, his outsight, all the elements seemed as they should be. The trees were as sturdy as ever, the earth as firm beneath his feet. Yet they were hollow. It wasn't a case with the Vale folk hiding from strangers, as Garen said. It felt to him, too, as though they'd never been. He wasn't aware that he was whistling until he caught looks that mixed amusement and surprise directed his way from the others. He couldn't help a weary smile. Weary because even the muscles of his face felt overburdened, as though he were reshaping soft lead at being caught. It was something he did when he was lost in thought. Drove the brownies positively wild, made them join in themselves, which in turn, because of their voices were in no way a match for their desires, sent the eagles winging for maximum altitude, well out of earshot. It was a measure of his profound fatigue that not only was he beyond an emotional response to the memories of his lost companions, but also that he didn't notice. Simple tune, at least at first, descending thirds, and he paused a moment to listen to the notes rebound through the gullies, echo fading past echo until the air was once more still. It was no tune he remembered hearing, but something that seemed to flow naturally from him as he grew into a life as a sorcerer. Like sorcery, the melody built on what came before, growing in complexity with every refrain, and like magic at its best, it was wholly extemporaneous, an expression of purest intuition, leavened by his deepest feelings. A somber cast to this recital reflected a mood as sunless as the sky that absorbed him so completely he put a foot wrong and came near to tumbling off the trail. With a start, he recovered his wits and balance to find Elora Danan standing before him, a doughy waif with a haunted aspect to her eyes that was starkly at odds with the well-fed flesh that encased it. She had no notion of how her clothes were meant to be worn. Thorn had the sense from her that she blanked while being dressed, standing before her maids nearly naked and emerging promptly and exquisitely outfitted, without the slightest clue as to how it was managed. Still, she'd tried to arrange them as best she could, not terribly successful, from their perspective of either comfort or aesthetics. Her eyes were very large, the only burst of color in a body that was a casting made flesh. "Yes, Elora," he said gently, flicking his gaze past her to Taskmanion and Garen, watching concernedly. This was the first time the child had taken the initiative since they'd come ashore. "I know that music," she said. Her voice was broken, with a huskiness reminiscent of Shando, her larynx as cruelly and thoroughly savaged as her spirit seemed to be. "Something I used to whistle," he conceded, "when you were very young." "It's my fault," she said, bleakness spreading like oil across the sea from her eyes to her voice. I should have given Willow what he wanted. If I hadn't fought, none of this would have happened." "Stop it," he said. "Look at me," she cried, her tone disconcertingly as deep as his. "I'm cursed. The world's cursed. I never meant for anything bad to happen. I was just so scared." "There's no shame in that." He took her by the shoulders. A mistake. She broke his hold as though his hands were coated with acid. "What do you know, Peck?" And she made the last word as foul an obscenity as any he'd heard, so harsh in speech and intent that he actually flinched. "Don't you dare touch me!" she cried with a large portion of her own imperiousness. "You brought me to this. Nothing about my life was wrong until you showed yourself." "Everything was wrong, child," he thought, though it would have been better to have spoken it aloud. He was about to, but he never got the chance. He heard a scream from above, and was gripped by a staggering discontinuity of vision as he was wrenched from himself and cast into the raging consciousness of Bastion, glaring cold-eyed at 5 people below, frozen in place by the suddenness of the eagle's attack. "Oathbreaker!" he heard Rule cry from his perch on Bastion's soldiers. "Betrayer!" This from Frangine riding Enel. "Demon!" they cried together, even more of a curse than Elora's peck had been, a word meant to hurt worse than any weapon. His vision bifurcated. In the same moment, he saw himself as the eagle's back arched, her great wings belling outward to break her madcap descent, and beheld through his own eyes Enel's extended claws lunging for his face. Chapter 13. Thorin dropped and rolled. Reflex took him down. Wits sent his hands scrambling for a hold as he dropped over the lip of the trail. He had no doubts that the eagles were trying to kill him. That was clear from the manner of their approach and the furnace fury in their minds. But he had no intention either of giving them that satisfaction or harming them in return. He snagged a sapling second-year growth, scraping layers of skin from his palm as he used the momentum of his fall to pivot him back toward the trail, working hands and feet like a hedgehog to get him there, trying to protect himself while keeping track of the unfolding fight. Garen sprang to Elora's defense, but Enel executed a magnificent turn over the tip of one wing and used the other to swat the charging lad aside. Their bones may have been hollow, but the eagles were a match and more for Thorn in size of body, and they could strike with the force of a respectively sized bludgeon. Enel would have dropped on the Daikini, stabbing for his face with claws and beak to maim him, but Cori leapt from her perch on the slope, sword leaving an after image in its wake as she aimed a double-handed slash for the bird. Enel backpedaled furiously, making yet another impossible mid-air maneuver to avoid the blow. She saw at once the demon child's speed, so Enel made no attempt to climb to safety. She broke off the engagement by wheeling toward the ravine and jinking away through the trees. Rin wasn't so fortunate. He scythed Elora's legs out from under her to bring her down and clear her out of harm's way. The child had neither his reactions nor his experience. She stood frozen by the intensity of the ambush, dumb and upstanding as a post, the perfect prey. But when the weir turned from her to Bastion, he was met by an arrow from Rule's bow. No ordinary dart. That was obvious from an impact that threw him from his feet as though he'd been roped from behind. Brownies, too, had their secrets, generally choosing weapons that stung and annoyed, preferring to harry and humiliate a foe rather than do him actual harm. But when pressed, they could be as deadly as any, striking with poison that could drop a Daikini in a matter of steps, or as now, imbuing their missiles with a portion of their own life force to give it a striking power far exceeding its diminutive size. At its ultimate, a brownie could trade his life for that of a foe, and Thorn had no doubt that was where this engagement was meant to end, as Bastion's claws opened bloody stripes across Tack's flank before the eagle surged skyward for a second attack. Thorn lashed out with a gust of wind, using it as he would a punch, Bastion squalling in surprise and dismay as he found himself pushed away from his quarry. Rule, always better at a physical scrap than Frangine, managed another shot, but Cori used her sword to block it, her blade slicing the thorn in twain and thereby dissipating its force. She didn't stop there, but charged forward herself, compelling Bastion to follow his mate's example and flee down the ravine. "Damnation!" Garin cried, clambering soft-legged to his feet, with huge snuffling noises as he tried to stem the flow of blood from his nose. "Those birds, Drumheller! They were the ones traveling with you!" "Yes," was the flat reply. There was no hint of a geese or a glamour, not even the slightest whiff of entrancement. They came at him of their own free will, possessed by a rage that bordered on hatred, and allowed not the smallest hint of mercy. Not for him, not for Elora. "What has happened?" he breathed. But the question was rhetorical, for insight has already presented him with the answer. Embodied in that one awful word, both brownies and eagles had cried at him. Demon. He had become one of Corey's sire in order to bring her into the world, accepted that bonding fully and freely, and thereby branding himself as cursed and outcast in the eyes of all the Vale folk. It would be the same with the Daikini if they learned what he'd done. For those who unwillingly consort with demon kind were considered the most wicked and damnable of creatures, wholly beyond forgiveness or redemption. They attacked Elora because they feared he had corrupted her as well. There was nothing he could say to persuade them differently, because the signature of demonkind was their mastery of the arts of deception. For their own survival, they would assume his every word a lie and every gesture a trap. At least, the brownies had escaped Elora's tower. That was something. But it hadn't been a clean getaway, for one of Frangine's arms was wrapped tight to his body. That was why he didn't use a bow against them. And there was a wicked scar across Bastion's back that hadn't wholly healed. Likely wouldn't, from the stench it left behind him. They weren't clean wounds. They cast an infection deep into the bodies that would quickly consume them. He didn't know if he could heal them. Worse, he knew that if he called them back, he wouldn't get the chance. If they saw him, they would kill him. He snuffled himself, nostrils taunted by the faintest tang of smoke on the air. His mind was on other things he didn't notice. "Very nice," he told Corey as he passed her. "Sword knew what to do," she replied. "I just helped." He stopped and stared, truly looking at her for perhaps the first time. She was right-handed, and that sleeve had suffered from all their travails, to the extent where she'd finally torn it off at the shoulder. The lines of her arms were smooth. This was a body that had always been healthy, and then honed to its keenest edge. That was clear from the easy movement of her muscles. There was a knot tattooed about the biceps, deceptively simple at a glance, representing the endless life cycle of birth and rebirth. Toward the wrist, covering the lower half of her forearm, a far more complex and delicate filigree, as though the engraver had sought to replicate a pattern of black lace on her skin. A startling contrast to find so overtly feminine a decoration on such a determinedly strong figure. Whoever the woman had been, she had defied easy typecasting. In that, she and the demon child were disturbingly alike. Corey spoke out of the side of her mouth, offering only a fraction of her concentration while devoting the rest to sentry duty. She lounged loose-limbed against a boulder, her sword lying at the ready across her lap, positioned so that she had a clear view of the scene below while remaining protected by a tight clutch of trees from any attack from behind. She might be overwhelmed, but Thorn doubted she'd ever be taken by surprise. It was a comforting thought. Rin had shifted sideways where he lay to clear himself from Elora. That was all he could manage. Thorn could see from the shallow, tender way he'd breathed that the impact of Rule's bolt had broken bones, and he knew from experience that Bastion's slash would be as bad. Elora was on her knees, close beside the weir. A smear of darkness, the neutral twilight stole away even the scarlet of fresh blood, across her front, in stark opposition to the argent purity of her skin. "He's hurt," she said lamely as Thorn approached. "Any pain?" the Nelwyn asked as he hunkered beside Rin. Eyebrows raised in an apparently universal expression of incredulity, but his answer was as to the point as Thorn's question. "Hurts to breathe, hurts to move. Those parts of me that still can, I mean. Legs numb below where I'm cut. Probably loss of blood. I've no sense of poison. Think I'm leaking like a sieve." Thorn placed a hand gently on the wound, shook his head in relief. "It's a mess, but he missed any of the major vessels. Your fur ate up most of the force of the blow. Bastion hadn't accounted for that when he struck." "Lucky me." "Very much so, Weir. Any of the rest of us be holding our guts in our hands and wondering how to put them back inside."
"Nelwyn!"
Rin hissed warningly, with an urgent flash of expression toward the side where Elora knelt. "Was that supposed to be me, then?" she asked in a very small voice. Very likely, as was I, for Enel and Frangine.
He knows 'em, said Garin, joining them. Traveled with 'em, those gobshite lamb swipers.
There was a metallic thickness to his voice that told Thorn he was still bleeding, so the sorcerer fished about in his pouch for a vial and a clean square of cloth. A drop of liquid, a hurried incantation, and he handed the dressing up to the Pathfinder, telling him to hold it over his nose and breathe deeply.
Same for me, please,
requested Rin, good humor belied by the evident weakness of his voice. I wish.
Oh, joy.
Not to worry. I can pull you through. I need some time is all.
Drumheller, we may not have any.
Say again, Garin. What are you talking about?
Take a breath. Couldn't smell before, 'cause, the crap in my nose. But it's plain as death now.
He didn't comprehend what the Pathfinder meant at first, as he took in a heady mix of evening scents. Growing things, old and young, sprouting from a rich, loamy earth, touched faintly at its point, thank heaven, by the salt tang of the ocean air. Someone's lit a fire, he said without thinking.
That's a fact.
Thorn rose to his feet, wondering if his face had gone as pale as Elora's. That can't be, he said. What's happening? Elora asked.
Torch, perhaps?
He wondered, knowing that was hopeless.
Close enough to smell, close enough to see. I'm thinking this is ways off still, thank the Maker.
But coming our way, Garin shrugged.
Can we afford to assume different?
It can't be, Thorn repeated, as though his words alone would make it so.
Bugger that, Peck, scorned Havelhand. I've seen the greatest city of the coast turn to ice and spun crystal, and a fair decent woman tore it inside out before my eyes. If nothing else holds true no more, why should this?
What does he mean? Elora, again, fright skittering across the body of her voice. Hopefully nothing, Thorn told them both, but it's best we move.
I can't,
Rin said matter-of-factly. His senses were keener than Dakini. Thorn needed only a glance to see that he knew the truth. Corey, Thorn said, once this dressing's applied, he's all yours. If the eagles come again, Drumheller, one crisis at a time, please. You can manage him. None of the rest of us can.
I'll carry the sword,
offered Garin, to back away with upraised hands and an apologetic mien when Corey thrust it empathetically into its scabbard and tightened the sling that bound it across her back.
My apologies, sword mistress,
Rin said with unaccustomed formality, and a turn of phrase Torn associated more with princess-like anacory, for the convenience, and accented now with a shrug that was quintessentially him,
for bleeding all over you.
Your blood, fussy, she said, slinging her arms forward across her shoulder. Keep it to yourself. It hurt the weir when she rose. There was no way he could hide it. His choked grimace sparked a tiny outcry from Elora, as though his pain had struck a resonance in her.
We have to move fast, Garin told them. We might as well put a blade through Rin's heart right here and now,
Thorn snapped back at him, and have done with it.
Just saying what's what is all.
High ground, bare ground, that's the drill. Find us the quickest way. Garin took off at a jog, moving as easily through the growing night as he would in bright sun. And don't thank me, Thorn muttered beneath his breath, for the mage sight.
Thank you,
a voice said softly from the side. You're most welcome, Elora Danan. I told the sea to stop, she said, after they'd walked a while. I was wondering about that. What gave you the idea? It was so awful below. I was so sick. I thought I'd heave out my insides. Still sore. She rubbed herself across the belly, leavening the memory with a wan smile until that brought her hard up against the memory of Morag's end. She blinked very rapidly until Thorn handed her a cloth for her tears. I can manage. I wanted to stop. Suddenly this way came to me. Next I knew, I was on the deck, screaming my head off. Is that how things are supposed to work? She asked with sudden urgency, and a sense from her that it wasn't how she wanted it to be. I don't know, he answered honestly. No one really does, I suspect. Some powers, like some people, don't like being told what to do. Elora flushed a little at the memory of how she'd treated her own servants. They prefer to be asked. Pride of place and being are not exclusive to Dakinis or to Brownies or any single race, he smiled. Not even no one's. We each have our wishes, our imaginings, and they're all colored by experience and prejudice. They're right for one, not necessarily for another. There's a craft to magic, as there is to monarchy. You start with a gift, as you might claim Throne, the trick is learning to use it properly, mastering energies. He waved a hand, leaving trails of languid rainbows from the tips of his fingers. Mastering people, mastering yourself. The 12 domains are ruled by prideful folk on both sides of the veil. None among them are comfortable with the idea of an overlord, no matter how sacred. That's the trouble with prophecy. His smile turned ironic to point the comment. Always too damned ambiguous. You never used to curse. You never saw me in a bad temper. You're the one who made me laugh. There was a sense of quiet discovery to her words, a pale echo of the wonder Corey had exhibited earlier as she labored to make connections between the decimated images in her memory. Thorn was impressed, as much by the effort she was making as by her success. We all did in our way. You made it easy. Why did you leave me? The ache of loss was naked in her tone, as it was in his when he replied. I thought, a shrug, my work was done. I had a home, family, responsibilities. I'm an Elwyn. The adventure might be a great one, but the parts we play in it are supposed to be small, like us. That's the way it's always been. You were where you rightly belonged, among those best able to protect you. Good thing you left. You might have shared their fate. Or saved them. Elora, what happened that night? Do you remember? She shook her head, slowly, purposefully, considering the question, truly seeking an answer. I was warm, snug abed. Then I was burning. The fire that claimed Bavmorda had come from me. That's what I thought. I couldn't move, not any part of me. She held out her arms and the gaze at the transformed skin with a sad smile. My skin was cast metal. I couldn't even speak. I was thrown through the sky, through sea, through the heart of the world, through the stars in the heavens. I became a star myself. Everything I was torn away. Her voice trailed off as she was silent for a time. Thorn didn't try to press her, but wondered instead how closely the truth of her journey resembled his brief fusion with the demon. If that was so, if she'd also encountered those unworldly creatures, that would explain why the brownies were so ready to believe the worst of her. Frustration was a sour, bilious taste in his mouth. It was like being blind and trying to visualize the face of the world from a handful of random spot flash images. But why should I expect it to be anything else? He thought. We're rational beings. How can we make sense out of chaos? Even the way we frame the question invalidates it. Then, she said at long last, her voice as remote as the memory, I was cold, freezing, screaming. I was hungry. I was hurt. I was scared. I was so scared. My bed was gone. Tirasleen was gone. I was somewhere different, someplace strange. The place in Angwin? The courtyard, actually, she nodded. They built me a house, then they built me the tower. Elora's Eyrie. They were always nice to me, but they were always afraid. All things considered, I guess they had good reason. Bollocks. They'd been climbing all the while, along a track whose shallow grade made it seem far easier than it turned out to be. Thorn's legs felt held altogether by rubber bands, and those badly frayed. He doubted Elora fared much better and didn't want to think about Taskmanion. Even Corey was showing the strain. Your friends are angry, Elora said suddenly. I saw them with you in the tower. She flushed, which had the effect of underlying her silver skin with a hint of rose gold like the promise of a sunrise. I called them bugmen. Awful little bugmen, to be precise. Then, more seriously, after a small-sized pause, I placed them in harm's way and left them there. To save me? Things happened too fast. I couldn't do both. Why am I so important? Blessed if I know, but I think you are. Nobody ever asked me if it was what I wanted. I'm not sure our approval is required. That isn't right, Drumheller. He looked at her. No offense, but that never seemed to bother the sacred Princess Elora. A small smile touched the corner of her lips. No, she conceded slowly, stretching out the N. It didn't. Then they were traversing a middling ridge, a subordinate offshoot of Downhall Mount that ran along the peninsula to the end of Duatha Headland, and as they neared the top, none had any notion which way to go next, whether it would be better to walk the crest for a time or descend the far side. Garen was waiting. He was scratched all over, bark scrapes and nettle cuts from climbing a tree. Whatever he'd seen hadn't made him happy. You have to run, he told them without preamble, puffing like bellows. For your lives! Thorn followed the angle of his body and beheld a roseate glow that reached from shore to shore across the peninsula. No, was all he could say in absolute denial.
It's burning, Peck, fast as a wildfire. Trees, candling like they was soaked in pitch.
No! With a terrible violence born wholly from fear, the Daikini yanked him off his feet by the shoulder till their faces were level.
I've seen it, damn your maggoty eyes. Don't matter that it's not supposed to be impossible, that nothing's supposed to torch these woods. They're burning just the same, and us with them we don't go now, fast as we're able.
Where? He swung around, shoving Thorn bodily toward the looming peak.
Crestline's good the whole way,
Garen husked.
Make sure of that myself. It's a bear of a climb, but there's a bulge in the rocks. Forms a natural break. More stone than trees beyond. No fuel for a decent burn. Reach that wall, then the slopes to Doomhall beyond. We're good for another day.
There was sound now they hadn't been heard from within the ravines, a crackling that boot soles made striding across a bed of dry nettles and twigs. Smoke was thickening as well, reminding him of autumn nights in the village, with the scent of a score of hearth fires spicing the breeze. Can you manage, Corey? Thorn asked, after shaking himself free of the Pathfinder's grasp. Garen was growing more agitated by the moment, as though his body were shot through with lightning so full of energy that he could hardly contain himself. He wanted to run. He couldn't abide the delay. I run, she said flatly. He dies.
So set him down, Garen snapped. Do him quick as a mercy, and let's be off. Damn it all the time.
No! This cry came from Elora. He risked his life for us, she protested further, rushing to help as Corey eased her burden down. I owe him mine. We can't just leave him.
He can't go, Highness. We can't stay. Simple as that.
He's right, agreed Rin. Thorn knew that, had rationality marshaled like a conquering horde inside his head to provide all the arguments and justifications needed for the decision. But there was a wild giddiness within him as well, a residue of the demon's chaos that flew in the face of presumed common sense, a resonance of the healing madness that gripped him up on the scar. He felt as though he'd walked away from so many friends and companions, always for good and noble and necessary reasons. He couldn't bear another such. He wanted the fight. Bollocks, Elora said, closing the subject as far as she was concerned. Then Thorn knew he could probably overrule her. She was trusting him to save them, trusting him to give himself the chance to try. Garen tried to make the decision for them by yanking Elora by the arm and tucking her close.
Be daft and die if that's your will, he told them. I'll not weep for fools, and I'm sure not let the sacred princess burn with you.
He got the words out, but didn't make it farther than a single step before Elora wiggled her legs between his, in a move she'd seen Corey make, and tripped him up. They sprawled together, but she planted a foot against his flank and heaved him clear. His recovery was quicker, but she had a knife drawn from the deep folds of her bundled gowns, which she'd been carrying like a talisman since coming ashore.
Don't do this, Highness, he implored. I beg you.
Don't touch me like that, ever.
I'm sorry. I just want to keep you safe. Please.
He was edging fractionally closer, a crab-wise sequence of tiny motions that Thorn recognized too late to be of help, as his warning cry coincided with Garen's lunge for Elora's weapon. She flinched and slashed wildly. He got a hand on her, but also caught a shallow gash along the opposite forearm for his trouble. Had it just been the two of them scrapping, he likely would have overmastered her, but Corey's sword hissed clear of its scabbard, the reinforcement prompting an immediate backpedal from the Pathfinder as he scrabbled beyond their reach, tumbling ass over tea kettle to the base of a small depression.
Does she mean so little? He raged, recovering his feet. That you'll let her burn?
She means so much, Elora answered, surprising them all, that they'll let her make her own decision and accept the consequences.
Fools!
The Pathfinder turned full face on Thorn, dark emotions plain as he worked himself into a violent state.
To place your trust in the Peck when all he does is lead you from disaster to disaster. Yeah, saw what happened to the shipmaster. Do you want the same for yourselves? If there's evil come to Angwin, by the blessed bride, I say it's him. Aye, Peck, it's your doing, all the horror that's fallen on the land. Damn me for not seeing that from the start, and stopping you when I had the chance. You saying you're trying to save the sacred princess? Well, I'm asking if stealing her ain't what brought down the curse on all our heads. Should have figured you were in the dungeon for good reason, and by God, left you there. You care nothing for Angwin. You care nothing for her. In any other situation, they'd be at blows by now, the Pathfinder trying his best to beat any and all foes to bloody pulps. But his rage could find no such release so long as Cori blocked him with her sword, which left him nothing to turn on his foes save parting words, and with them he was gone. Demon you are named, it's demon you are, and I pray you burn for it. You're wrong, Elora cried as Havilhand pumped himself for all he was worth along the steepling rise. He's wrong, she said again to Thorn and the others. We won't burn then? From Rin, all naive innocence with intent to amuse. Thorn looked him in the eye, having already decided to stop their hearts before the flames claimed them. No, he said simply. Well, that's a relief. Nor die neither? Can't promise that, I'm afraid, was Thorn's response, and now he smiled. Now you tell us. The weir rolled his eyes for dramatic emphasis. Into the hollow, Thorn instructed them, all business. As Elora passed, he touched fingertips to her arm, the barest brush touch. Thank you, he said. Truly. Traditional fire sounds now, like drum, heralds before an advancing line of battle, bringing with them the first flashes of heat. All the humidity was vanishing from the air. Thorn could feel the skin of his face tighten as the scene was sucked dry of ambient moisture. The stand of trees was still too thick, the trunks stood too tall, for them to get a decent view of the approaching conflagration. By the time they saw it in full, it would be upon them. Conditions were changing with dramatic speed, as though the hurricane that was battering the coast had turned its attentions full on the land. The hollow wasn't so terribly deep. Thorn could see over the top simply by standing erect, but there was nothing better available. Cori set Rin in the deepest part, taking up position on one side, with Elora lying beside him on the other, both snuggling as close to the weir as they were able. An explosion caught Thorn's eyes, downslope in the neighboring ravine, and he watched a sinuous serpentine shape, colored as though blood were made molten and leavened by pure gold, so that it gleamed from within an intensity to shame the sun, dive into the trunk at its base. His eyes followed its progress up the heart of the tree, although at first nothing could be seen by the naked eye, until the wood itself began to glow. Every leaf burst alight, and then dollops of raw fire leaked into view, the way a smithy might use a white-hot bar to sear his way through a plate of metal. Fountains of flame rocketed from the ground as the roots were consumed, and with a tremendous whoosh of expanding gas, the tree itself instantaneously combusted, brilliantly ablaze from floor to crown. Bastard! Thorn snarled, yet again in helpless rage as the fire drake leapt to another target. He was sweating. In the matter of seconds it had taken the tree to die, the fire had pumped the temperature a score of degrees from autumn to summer. He pulled a bottle from his pouch and opened it over the hollow, not so much to drench anyone lying within or the ground beneath, but primarily to remind them what it felt like to be wet. A pool wouldn't save them, when the smallest breath of that superheated air would scorch their lungs worse than a cauterized iron, and the water itself would be heated to a rolling boil. His cloak wasn't big enough, so he borrowed one of Elora's, shaking it out to cover the whole of the depression. A spray of water went on it as well. In one big advantage, in a fast-moving fire such as this, he knew. Its intensity made it a horror almost beyond imagining, but its very speed made it one that didn't have to be endured long, where a more leisurely blaze might be around a while. On one hand, speed and intensity were the hallmarks of a brush fire. They didn't occur in oldest-growth forests. On the other hand, Sherlindria's groves didn't burn, period. Fact of nature, like the rising of the sun. Presumably, that was where the fire drakes came in, happy to consume what a match couldn't possibly ignite, which meant, ultimately, that all bets were off. The deceiver's doing, of course, his actions gradually establishing a recognizable pattern as he took what was normal and violently twisted it back upon itself, casting order into chaos, setting one natural force at deadly odds against another. Fire drakes represented one of the primal forces of creation, according to one legend. They were born with the universe and swam in the molten hearts of the stars themselves,
while another belief held that it was they who burned the holes in the fabric of the sky that allowed the heavenly radiance to shine through to the waking world below. Kin to dragons, some theorized, but where the one was considered to be the quintessence of thought and reason, these were beings of raw and untamed passion, quicksilver emotions to go with their protean flesh. It wasn't known if they were intelligent. Like demons, their minds worked in ways neither Daikini nor Veilfolk could comprehend. The only surety was that they were a power to be reckoned with. Only a first-rank mage would even consider summoning one, but only the most absolute and all-encompassing of wards could contain their tremendous heat. The problem was, fire drakes apparently hated in equal measure being confined. From the moment of manifestation, they were reputed to fight like berserkers to break free, with consequences to the world if they did, couched in the more dire, fearsome terms. Among all the sorcerers Thorn had ever met, the histories he'd ever heard told or read himself, these terrible creatures were considered without exception to be the bare best left sleeping in its den, to be ever avoided and never disturbed. Yet the deceiver had summoned and unleashed not a single such horror, but an entire clutch. Madness! Thorn breathed because he still couldn't believe it was actually happening. Madness! Nothing gentle about sight or sound any longer. He knew it was time to get under cover, but the sight held him with the attraction of a cobra for a mongoose. There was no way to see far. The forest grew too tall around, preventing the spectacular vistas that should be the stock in trade of such a vantage point. But what was in sight before him was rapidly becoming an inferno, wind hotter than the breath of a dragon, more appropriate to a desert where only scrap of moisture is what lies within your own body. A roar like an avalanche, as though all the furnaces that ever were had been brought together in this one spot and stoked hot enough to consume the world. A hand tugged his trouser leg, Elora, and he ducked beside her. The child hurriedly brushed stray sparks from his hair before they had a chance to do some mischief. "I can spell you all to sleep," he said. "That would make this easier." "If it's not an essential requirement," Rin answered for them all, "I think I'd rather watch." Thorn lay on his stomach and sank his fingers into the soil, already warming to the touch. There were root networks below, winding around the rocks that composed the ridge, and he knew the fire drakes would happily try a jump from them to the people above given the opportunity. He went to work on their clothes first, recalling what it was like on Morag's schooner, when the wind howling, the seas booming over the deck. They'd been soaked to the skin, soaked, it seemed, through the skin, every particle of their being saturated with water. As then, so now, remembering the wet was his injunction, cast into the earth as well as their clothes. This was a place of generous weather. It had to be to support such luxuriant growth. The sea air created an environment of near perpetual dampness, and when they weren't actual storms to soak the landscape, the fog did its best. He chanted of winter, cool time, rainy season, showers falling every day, saturating the earth, a time that was rich with both the promise and actuality of life. He didn't neglect the air in this, but reminded it of how cool it was on the spring morn, possessing more than a bite still of the winter just past. Crisp and invigorating, far from removed for the oven without. He didn't speak. There was no point as the leading edge of the blaze swept over them. He'd seen battles where thousands had come together in a clash of arms that rivaled the heavenly thunder. They were nothing compared to this. He'd stood on the slopes of the Continental Divide with titanic explosions of thunder tearing at the sky so close above it seemed like he could reach out and touch the cloud base, where the shock of the discharge was felt as much as heard. Also, nothing. They were caught up in a reverberating barrage, where the ordnance was trees being blown to bits by the resin that was their lifeblood being instantly heated to vapor. Like the pops made by a long log in the household hearth, magnified a millionfold beyond the capacity of ear or mind to accept. He felt a trickle of warmth along his back, as though a line of hot wax had been dripped the length of his spine, and he redoubled his efforts, calling forth visions of the great waves that smashed the boat and the desperate struggle to survive after the schooner's destruction. He could feel Elora shake beside him. The lesser trembles may have been fear, but mostly he was certain it was remembered cold, her garments so sodden they plastered themselves to her silver skin. His were no better, as this enchantment shunted aside the one that normally kept him dry. Problem here, if his teeth chattered, he'd lose the rhythm of the spell, and that would be their doom. There was no margin of safety. They were in the heart of a true holocaust, balanced on the most razor-thin of margins. As Garen counted on his legs to save him, so were the rest dependent on Thorn's will. He was weeping with effort, taking enough breath to get through a single repetition of the spell, each cycle leaving more of a hollow sensation in his chest. Nelwyns didn't run, weren't built for it. That was a Daikini affection, but he'd seen the tall folk when they'd met for games, especially those who attempted the distance races. He looked worse than they. And though of the time he crossed the roof of the world, the greatest of mountain ranges, with peaks so high no living thing could reach the summit. Rashly, he'd given it a try and found himself driven back when he reached a point where the deepest of breaths still left his lungs starving for air. Strange, he remembered thinking, with a scholar's detachment and a warrior's frustration, then as now he didn't like losing, to feel like you're drowning when you're a continent removed from any decent body of water. Same sensation now, as he worked himself even harder to less effect. Ultimately, he would reach the point where his diaphragm had no more strength to expand his lungs, or his heart to manage another beat. His gamble had been that the fire would blow past them long before that moment, only it seemed to have stalled. He wasn't surprised. Elora swiped his arm. There was a faint glow beneath the surface of the sand that put him in mind of a foundry, where a forger had trickled a current of molten metal into a mold, a more fierce, actively hungry radiance than he'd seen from a volcanic lava flow, because the liquid rock began to cool the instant it emerged. There was no cast-off heat from the fire drake. The wards Thorn cast were holding fine. The opposition was merely making its presence felt. "This is different from the ocean," Elora said in his ear. She spoke in a normal tone, which meant he shouldn't have been able to hear a word. He could barely make proper sense of his own thoughts, but he understood her fine. "Yes," he said, not trying to be rude, but not having the voice or breath to spare. "That was natural. This is something else." "Yes." "Willow's doing. The deceiver's doing, Elora. Whatever face that creature wears, it isn't Willow. It never was Willow." He had to pause every few words to chant the next passage of his spell, which made his speech halting and disjointed. He couldn't even spare the effort to project his half of the conversation through mind speech. Too much of his focus was required to sustain his work. "But the deception worked on me, those who possess the power to know better. Sherlindria above all would have known a lie if she accepted him. Some part of it, some part of him must have been true." "Impossible!" But beyond that protest, he had no argument to refute her logic. The both of them watched the gleaming sinuosity beneath them, while it in turn cast enough of a glow to highlight all their faces in turn. "You never answered my question, Nelwyn." Another mystery-defying simple solution. "Nothing to say worth the speaking of it, I'm sorry," he added, or, he thought, the sparing of the breath. "It must be nice to be a piece of gold," she mused. "At least then you'd have some sense of why you were valued. Do you think this fire means She caught herself, offered a shy demi-smile of apology. "I mean, our adversary," and Thorn tossed a look at her, way at the deliberate choice of the plural pronoun, her smile broadening a fraction more in return. "Has given up on taking me alive?" "No," was his flat reply, "but you'll forgive me for not putting your supposition in an empirical test." "You don't look well, Drumheller." He had no energy to spare for a shrug, much less a spoken reply. There was a burning in his body that had nothing to do with the fires outside. Hot wax turned to acid, coursing along the pathways of his heart and nerves, lacing itself between the cords of muscles until every act of living was accompanied by its own special lash of pain. It was endurable, but it was also getting worse. "Is there anything we can do?" she asked. "We?" She met his gaze without attempting to hide the fear behind her eyes, but also without taking back a word of her offer. "I'd like to try." "As you wish, most royal highness." She clutched his arm at the first. He assumed it was a burst of second thoughts. "I am Elora Danan," she told him, and he responded with a grin of approval, taking a last breath before flinging aside the cloak and rising into hell. The world was fire. On every side, seemingly close enough to touch. Flames rose to form a roof above them. The ground cracked and seared as badly as any slab of meat. Trees remained mostly as residual after-images, defined by the ever-shifting shapes of the fire drakes that consumed them. Those that hadn't yet been blown to bits radiating shimmering bands of heat, but the visual scale from golden yellow with scarlet highlights to a brightness so intense it was wholly bereft of color. Amidst this inferno, Elora was likewise transformed. Her skin was an ideal reflected surface, and the fiery elements around them restored a warmth to her appearance that had been lost, painting her in wild mixtures of the hottest colors until it seemed to Thorn that she was herself composed of living flame. Through the fire moved the fire drakes, as serpents would through water, with their boneless sinuosity of eels kept at bay by the boundaries of Thorn's wards, but never straying far. Always returning to press there, nudge there, ever testing for that fatal hint of weakness that would allow them entry. Elora couldn't help herself, her hand leaping forward of its own accord to touch the nearest one, Thorn's reacting as quickly to snap her back. "You hurt me," she said, rubbing her wrist where his fingers had left their mark. "I'm sorry." His head was pounding, the glare like spines through his eyes, and he despairing at the arrogance, the madness that had put him in this place, in this hopeless fight. Of their own accord, Garen's accusations sounded in memory. "Peck," he heard, a chorus of voices, slippery and melodious, caressing with warmth. "Peck, peck, 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 peck." The catcalls rose and fell, gaining in mockery, as the words themselves crashed against him like hurled stones. He'd heard the diminutive his whole life. It was part and parcel of an Elwyn's lot, whether as gentle derision or true insult. "Stop saying that!" cried Elora, only to have her own words thrown back at her in the same dissonant musicale. "Foolish little fleshling!" And before their eyes a number of the creatures flowed together to briefly form the image of something much greater, whose true nature was achingly beyond their ability to comprehend, before dissolving again to their normal state. "What was that?" Elora asked, more entranced than afraid. "Tales tell of a monstrous celestial, unknowable. Some beliefs refer to it as the Phoenix, Alpha and Omega, beginning and end and beginning of all, the fire that consumes yet brings forth rebirth. It's so beautiful. It's all so beautiful." He had to concede that was true. "To pit your mortal strength against us," they heard further, with chittering of laughter. "Got that right?" He and Elora heard the effort in his voice. "No!" she said to him, and then she turned back to the flames to repeat herself. "No!" It wasn't a command, he realized. She wasn't imposing her will on the flames as she'd tried to do with the water. Instead, more of a statement of opposition. "This is wrong," she continued. "Why do you wish us harm when we've done none to you?" "Our nature." "To burn the world to ash?" "Yes, yes, 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 yes." The fire drakes were giddy with delight at the image, swirling so fast and brightly across the field of Thorn's vision that even closing his eyes didn't help, scarlet and gold stripes branding themselves across the insides of his lids. The heat was so intense here that the last of his strength couldn't wholly shield them any longer. He felt baked and didn't want to think of how Taskmanion felt under his fur. Around them, the fire had coalesced into a whirlwind, a vortex of unbelievable proportions that no longer needed any outside wind to push it along. Here was a monster that created its own, a juggernaut engine of absolute destruction that pulled air to its center just like a hurricane, stoked it hot enough to vaporize steel, and spat it away to carry flames to new tinder. Such a blaze as this would cast a glow to rival the ice radiance of Angwin and hurl its superheated poison to the top of the atmosphere, along with smoke sufficient to blot out the day. "Then you would cease to be," Elora noted simply, "for what would sustain your fire, unless there's nothing more to burn, if even the hope of life is gone? Where then the promise of rebirth?" As she spoke, she held out her hand once more, and, to his shame, Thorn found he hadn't the strength left to hold her back. She passed the boundary of the wards as though they weren't there, without disrupting the matrix in the slightest. The barest tip of her finger touched the nearest fire drake, stroking its back as it slipped past the way she might a cat, and it arced with a rapture of its own at the attention. Another twisted knot-like and came straight for her, diving into the child's body as if flesh itself were no barrier between them. Thorn's heart near to stopped as he believed he was witnessing in her what he'd seen destroy the tree earlier. Worse, by passing through her, it circumvented the wards as well, which meant the rest of them were likewise condemned. Elora began to glow from within as the fire drake slid beneath her skin, as it did beneath the earth. The child swayed in time to a music Thorn couldn't hear, suddenly possessed of a boneless grace that had to come from the creature within. Her hair radiated out from her skull, as though she were moving under water to burst alight, separate strands of flame that miraculously burned without consuming. Only Elora's smile, the one he remembered from when they'd first met, kept Thorn from a reaction that would have destroyed them all. She was silver before, she'd become the essence of sun gold, flush with the majesty of the dawn. When she looked at him, there were no more whites to her eyes. All he saw were cobalt pools against a background of flame. She held her hand before her, as if seeing it for the first time, fist clenched, then released. In its hollow was a tiny shape with wings, and Thorn felt an awe that hadn't touched him since the birth of his first child. Now his hands moved forth with a will of their own, forming a cup beside Elora's. Unspoken invitation for the tiny fire eagle to step from her to him. And so it did, clawed feet leaving sizzle marks on his flesh with every step, as though to make plain a difference between him and Elora. He looked into the creature's eyes. Somehow that wasn't hard, though the little thing could be enclosed within the globe of his hands, its head smaller than his thumbnail when he raised it up before him. The sight of it seemed to fill the field of his vision. One eye was sorrow, the other joy. Both brought forth their share of tears. He held his father's hand at the moment of his death, and his son's the moment after birth. His nostrils filled with the scent of wildflowers, the bouquet he'd made for his wife when they met in the courting day, and tasted the acrid tang of ozone and sulfur that reeked in Bavmorda's sanctum. He felt an ache that swept out from his heart with such force that he thought it had broken, and this was the final moment of being before the dark claimed him, for all that had been won and lost before, and what remained to be. He blinked, because the bird was no longer where it was. It had slid back to stare at him from Elora's eyes, and bid sad, smiling farewell with her lips, its crest encompassing her head to give it a gravitas and maturity that no span of human years could equal. It had touched him, but been one with her. He stood in darkness, and though he'd gone blind, Elora stood before him, lambent silver in the night, which thankfully proved his fears wrong, but brought forth a whole new host of horrors in their turn once he realized she was stark naked. That was about all the time allowed him for this set of worries, because he took a reflexive breath to fill his lungs to bursting, and dropped to all fours like a man accursed, more sick than any living being had a right to be, as he found himself flooded with the stench of charred wood and ravaged earth. Corey held him till the spasms passed, while Elora fumbled in his pouch for water. He tried to tell her there was no use, the bag's special properties worked only for him, but the shape of the bottle in his mouth, the cool spring flowed across his tongue, made crystal clear how pointless that was.
"It went away," Rin said in wonderment. "The fire! Just like that!"
"Elora," Thorn husked. "I have no idea," the girl told him. Her mouth worked, her eyes alive with a twinkling brilliance that was a fair match for the merry light in Rin's eyes. She gestured with her hands, using all the tools of her physical being to pound her thoughts into something she could express, only to end in a sigh of defeat. "I have no idea," Elora said again helplessly. The words, the very concept, made her laugh. She couldn't stop herself. She was too ridiculously happy just to be alive. "Makes us a pair, then," he tried to say, to comfort her, but her laughter was infectious, although his came brokenly, chortles separated by huge gasps of breath. Rin joined in as well, although he winced almost as much, as the movements of his chest tweaked his wounds. Only Corey stayed silent, watching the three of them in puzzlement while the paroxysm of relief ran its natural course. Thorn tried to explain, but he couldn't find space or breath to get the words out between guffaws. To his amazement, as the echoes of their laughter faded in the distance, her lips creased upward in a small smile. He reached out to her, and when she hesitated, unsure of what was being asked of her, took hold and pulled her into his arms, holding her close as tears flooded his cheeks. He'd laughed so hard he was crying, and not alone either, as he felt himself and Corey gathered into Elora's embrace. Blindly, because he knew the weir couldn't rise, Thorn reached out a hand to Rin, and there they stayed, a circle of life, of hope, of victory. It didn't last. It wasn't meant to. Thorn found his spirit willing, albeit under protest, but his flesh far weaker, and he needed Corey's assistance to once more stand erect. He had both cloaks in hand as he rose and held them out to Elora. "Actually," Elora said in a smallish voice as she wrapped the water and smoke-sodden wool around her, "I wouldn't object to those clothes you offered earlier." The view from the reef was desolation, to match the bleakest soul. Only a few trunks had survived the Holocaust. They stood like cenotaphs in a random scattering across a starkly barren landscape. It was a moment when Thorn wished he had no use of mage sight, and knew the others felt the same. The slopes had been seared to the bare rock, in some places layered with ashes deep as a daikini knee. The ground was cracked and blistered, burned free of moisture down to bedrock. About their hollow it had been fused to gleaming glass, in a circle of false ice that fell away from them on every side for a score of body lengths. "What stopped it?" Rin asked. They were all speaking in hushed tones as if in a church. It seemed like sacrilege to make a sound in such a wounded place. "Elora did," Thorn replied. All joy fled from him, as it had when he beheld the ruins of Tirasleen. "Then I guess you really are the sacred princess," Rin said to Elora. In the midst of tucking shirt tails into her trousers, she gave him a look that would have made a fire drake quail. "I'm Elora Danan," she said, "for what that's worth." "Tonight, gentle friend," Rin said with considerable charm, "it's worth the world, at least to me." "They would have done this to the whole of the world, Drumheller," Elora said as she took in the enormity of the destruction and compared it with what might have been. "Outside and in," he nodded agreement. "Cracked to its core, burned everything they could, that's a surety. That's," a reflection on his face of what the snake had told them, "their nature." "Where's the sense to that?" she demanded of him. "To utterly destroy the world, you mean to conquer?" "Well," Thorn considered, "they wouldn't stop of their own accord, so either the deceiver assumed himself capable of doing the job, or—" "That, my friends," noted Rin from where he lay, "is a disturbingly ominous pause." "He assumed we would." "Hell of a way to take the measure of your opposition, Nelwyn, and you ask me." "Our foe is a creature of extremes, Rin, mad without question, but in no way stupid." "We're not safe here, Drumheller," Corey told them, a point he readily conceded. "But we can't move till Tasmanion's able." "Have you the strength for healing?" "Each time I think not. I discover there's more in the reservoir yet. Besides, Corey, a trek along this ridge to the top of Doomhall won't make me any stronger." "Think the Pathfinder made it?" Rin wondered aloud, speaking the question that Elora had feared to ask. "Well, we formed something of a fire break," Thorn told him while setting out some food for the others, "and the tools and medicines needed for the healing. The blaze swept around us on both sides like a tidal wave of flame, claiming everything below this crest, and as far up the south slopes of Doomhall as there was fuel to burn. If he stayed to the reef and climbed as hard as he ran—" "Oh!" A strangled gasp from Elora interrupted him, accompanied by a clutch of her hand on his shoulder so tight he winced and worried of a powdered bone. A stag stood beyond the smoothness of the fused earth. It was magnificent beast, standing as tall as the shoulder as Corey, with better than a dozen points to each of its widespread antlers. It appeared immovable, feet planted wide apart, head bowed under what must have been some impossible weight. There was a majesty about the animal that was matched only by an indomitable will. If the forest had a king, this was truly he. "Stay," Thorn told the others, but he might as well have saved his breath, because Elora took flight with that very word, as though she'd been waiting for its cue, only her trousers in place as she raced to their visitor. Corey held out the shirt that had been left behind. Thorn snatched it from her and strode after the girl. He knew what he would find. Elora stood so straight and still she might have been a statue, or someone who'd just felt the lash of a whip. She was crying. He wished he had tears enough left to join her. "I wanted to spare you this," he said. "That's why I told you to stay." The stag's whole body had been swept by the breath of the devil incarnate. Not enough to kill, not quickly, not decently. It had been seared from crown to hooves, skin made raw, blackened flesh, meat fresh off a grill. There was no pain, beyond that awful initial caress of flame, because the neural receptors had been burned away. That would quickly change as infections leached into the muscles and sinews and organs beneath. Its blood was probably already thick with poison, far beyond the ability of liver and kidneys to process. The shock would wear off, the euphoria fade, and in the madness of its pain, the animal would dash itself to death. As if she heard those thoughts aloud, Elora said once more, "No," in that same strangely still and resolute voice with which she'd addressed the fire drakes. "There's nothing to be done save put the poor thing out of its misery." "You're a sorcerer," she rounded on him. "You're a healer. You meant to do it for Rin. Why not for the stag?" "Because I'm alive," he wanted to say. "Because I have limits. I'm tired, and I'm weak, and I'm not even sure I could save the one, much less both." But nothing emerged save a slow nod of acquiescence, because when he came right down to it, the bedrock of his being, he didn't want to make any such choice. He wanted to save them both. Gray dawn, gray day, another in a series of monotonous dawns more suited to the polar realms than the once temperate Angwin. The air had a bite to it that heralded snow, but Thorn knew even a proper sheeting of the stuff wouldn't make this land look any less wretched. Light brought no improvement, only more evidence of how primal a catastrophe this had been. Thorn held out an apple slice, and the stag's broad tongue snatched it into his mouth. There was rage in the beast's eyes as he beheld the ruins of his domain, and a resolve that boded ill for those responsible. Thorn sat because he had no more strength to stand, with a body held together by strings like some badly constructed puppet. If someone else did the work, he could perform a semblance of major movements, walking for one, but initiative was beyond his grasp. The stag nuzzled his nose against Thorn's ear, his ragged hairs making the Nelwyn tickle, and was rewarded with another piece of fruit. He wasn't a pretty beast by any standards. Thorn drew the limit at cosmetic work, preferring to let nature herself finish that job. His coat was a frazzled patchwork of old growth and new, the skin beneath as tender and pink as a newborn's. He'd been in a really rotten mood for the next while or so as the regenerated nerve endings grew accustomed to their new envelope of flesh. Every sensation would be amplified to the point where the brush of a branch along its flank would seem more like the lash of a barbed whip. Nothing to be done for that, especially in the wild, part and parcel of the natural process of healing. Thorn hadn't given the stag any guarantees with his work, only a decent chance. Rin wasn't much better off. His bones were set and healing, the great wound itself closed. But he moved with an evident care that was at odds with both his normal demeanor and his physical grace. Thorn heard the hiss of Corey's sword being drawn, sensed the sudden tension in his companions, but he didn't care, as closed eyes presented him with a wholly different view of the scene. Annelle cocked her head, tightened her turn to grant him a better view, and their breath seethed in unison at the sight. "We do appear a pathetic bunch," he spoke aloud. "Leave you on your own one damn minute," Rule groused from ahead and below him. "You just go straight to hell." "You," Frangine offered haughtily as Thorn restored vision to his own eyes. "Smell." "It's been a busy night," was the Nelwyn's deadpan reply. "We've had no time for our toilet, or breakfast for that matter." "Is that to imply some obligation on our part, eh?" "Perish the thought. Corey," he called over his shoulder, "sheathe your blade. We're among friends." He turned a more baleful gaze back on the brownies. "I trust." "So do we." Rule didn't back off a step. "You left us, remember?" "You, as I recall, ran from me." "What did you expect, with a stench of demons about you?" Frangine took a delicate step forward, followed by a snort that would do an elephant proud.
Still there, thick as ever. Risk our souls simply by talking with you.
Then don't.
See if we care.
Then go! There was a silence. There were some shrugs.
Eagles won't let us.
This from Rule. And why's that? Rule cast him a sour look, a streetwise hustler before the magistrate.
They seem to feel we did you wrong. We saw you with this stag, and now she could see how done in you were. None of us thought you'd last through a single healing after standing up to those flames, witchets, much less two.
There were moments last night when I'd have agreed with you.
Could have turned her down, he gestured toward Elora. Had every reason.
It wasn't a matter of reason, Rule.
Yeah, that's the point, they say. You chose from your soul. If that hadn't changed, the demon taint didn't matter.
You disagree? The brownie's voice and manner turned deadly serious.
Drumheller, Rule said urgently, use your insight. Look through our eyes, with our hearts.
I have.
Then you see. You know. Frangine's too quiet when he says there's a stench of demon on you. It's nature tight to yours, as yours is to that one's.
He jerked a thumb at Corey.
Damnedest thing! She's as much yours in spirit as any natural child. It marks you, and not kindly. On the face of it, none of the wee folk will take you in, nor heed your entreaties. Nor ours, for that matter, should we stay with you. Figure our reaction was extreme. You've seen nothing yet. Outcast and anathema, you've made yourself. Across all the realms. Among the Vale folk, they'd as soon kill you as look at you. That's the way it's always been with demons.
They're wrong.
They won't listen, much less care. Ever stop to think, Frangine interjected, you and the demon weren't no accident. Big empty dungeon, could have chosen any cell. Why that one, eh? Maybe the deceiver, he pushes you down a path intended to cut you off from every natural ally.
I've thought of that, from the very first.
Ever think maybe he plans a seat of shadow in you?
There's a seat of shadow in us all.
Don't talk platitudes with me, Peck. You know blessed well what I mean. Demon shadow is different.
So is this child, Frangine, he indicated Corey. The demon's impulse didn't come from the deceiver. It grew from Elora. I chose to believe that's what's of me and her. In Corey is stronger and more lasting than what's of the demon. I choose to have faith.
Brownies! Elora Danan,
Thorn said, by way of polite introduction in answer to her outcry of delight. May I present my sometimes companions, Frangine and Rule? Frangine offered a courtly bow, Rule a nod of the head. She folded herself into a switchback of calf and thigh and body, dropping her backside to her heels and resting her chin on her knee with that jointless ease so common to the very young, even when they're a bit plump. I saw you in my eyrie.
And we likewise, lady.
I spoke harshly, to you and of you. For that I ask your pardon, and as well for not knowing you sooner. My memory may be a sieve now, but then I had no such excuse. I owe the pair of you so much. You deserved much better. But then, and her eyes turned hooded, so did everyone in Angwin.
Point to you, Drumheller,
Rule told him after raking his eyes across the girl.
She may be worth the effort after all.
Thank you, she said with a twist of her old asperity. I think. Should I assume the Eagles won you free?
Damn near thing it was too, eh?
Rule roared suddenly in his biggest voice, jumping and waggling his arms like a pipsqueak dervish.
Keep your damn distance, you damn horn-headed lummox!
And the stag, appropriately startled, backpedaled a few steps with a snort of surprise. He'd been intrigued by the little animates and stepped over to investigate further to see if they might prove edible. Another downside of so fast and furious a healing, it left all concerned, physician and patient, ravenous. Thought we were done when the night herons rolled out of their roost. My stick-legged birds, Elora cried. Are they all right? The night herons? Thorn was unsure whether to be astonished or aghast. Yours, Elora? He was genuinely puzzled. Well, they rooked in the tower. No one seemed too eager to shoo them away. She paused until the hoots of derision from the brownies ran their course.
That's a game worth seeing, Frangine chortled. Get thee gone, wicked wingy!
Rule affected a high-pitched voice and fey manner, flicking a hand at the wrist as though brushing off dust mote.
Be off! We'll have none of your rough sort about!
How long have they been there? Thorn wondered. As long as I have, I guess. What's so funny, you two? She got no satisfaction from her demand, as it sent the brownies into even greater paroxysms of hilarity. Rin and Corey exchanged a glance of confusion and decided to stay well clear. This was a confrontation best left to the principals. Certainly, Elora finished to Thorn, deciding herself that her best course was to ignore the little perishers. As long as I remember, we'd roost in my garden together. I'd feed them in my tree. I think I sort of liked them because no one would come near when they were about.
None would approach, Princess, Rule said in his matter-of-fact way, because herons are known to favor the taste of human flesh.
They're creatures of evil, Princess, Frangine told her in his most schoolmasterish tone. Not mine.
It isn't as if they had any bloody choice in the matter, you know. They're born that way.
Which condemns them forever, Frangine? You were wrong about Drumheller. That remains to be seen. But you were willing to take that risk. The herons can't learn a different way. They can't change. The brownie struck an attitude.
I don't believe my ears. I can't talk to the child. She's impossible.
They did me no harm, ever.
Some of us, missy,
said Frangine, waggling his sling for emphasis, which reminded Thorn of healing work still left to do,
weren't so fortunate.
Who looked after them? Rin asked suddenly.
Never even thought of that, Rule conceded. They're predators. They live for the hunt, and I've never seen or heard of them. They only eat what they've fresh killed.
Not in Angwin, Elora told them. Not the ones in my tower.
Must have given the locals pause, I'm thinking,
Rule continued, letting his thoughts choose their own path.
To see their savior princess consorting with such abominations. Why didn't anyone do anything about it?
Actually, Elora said, I don't believe anyone knew. Outside of my vizards, from a distance, to anyone looking from the ground or even the palace itself, they're just birds. They only came to visit when no one else was around.
No one else, Rin prompted, besides the vizards.
Elora nodded.
They knew,
the whir said,
but they didn't tell.
Can't be certain, from Frangine. Given Elora Danan's position at court and what happened to his wife and son, the king would have acted immediately to protect her from even the hint of threat.
You speak like you know him.
Not necessarily, Frangine interjected, saving Rin from any reply.
Your precious king sanctioned the presence of the Maizan in Angwin. Why not the herons as well? Maybe he believed they'd protect her. Nobody, was Rule's retort, is that naive. Present company accepted.
Enough, Thorn said quietly, and to his amazement was obeyed. He tried not to let the unexpected achievement go to his head. We need shelter, we need food, we need rest. Find those, and you can all argue to your heart's content. The stag huffed, pawing at the ground with a forehoof before using his horns to shunt Thorn around until he was facing the mountain fastness of Doomhall. Returning the favor, are you? He asked the stag, who offered another sharp exhalation that might have been agreement, might even have contained a breath of amusement. It's the easiest road, Thorn noted.
Too easy, do you think?
Asked Rin. The no one shrugged. Prudence dictates we assume the worst, namely that the deceiver must know we'd survived his holocaust. We can't afford to wait for his next move. Whether he comes for us himself or uses more surrogates, there's no decent path along the shore, and following any other route means slugging our way up and down those gorges. Anybody here feel up to that? The silence included even the wind, which chose that moment to pause. Right then, it's decided. To Doomhall we go. And with stately tread, the stag led them on their way. Chapter 14. The thought they have of view once they reach the Doomhall heights, the opportunity had properly gained their bearings, but the whole summit of the ancient peak was occluded by the storm. The cloud base settled in about a third of the way up the main slope, and if the winds blew were any indication, there was no going any further. As it turned out, the stag had no interest in leading them high, but picked his way instead along a track that meandered around the broad eastern flank of the mountain. The fire had flowed, as Thorn had surmised, cresting across the valleys like a storm surge against a beach, though its greatest intensity appeared to have been concentrated on the hollow where Thorn and the others had taken refuge. The stag set a gentle pace, for his own comfort as much as theirs, but it was soon apparent that they had followed Garen's lead. Only Corey could have possibly escaped alive. They had to stop more than once, and well before the end, the demon child had placed Thorn across her shoulders. He hadn't complained before she picked him up, but he didn't protest either. In truth, his hips were an ever-tightening knotwork of pain, and not even spells could keep away the surety that bone ground on bone. Elora looked to Ren, who lamented being denied the option of switching to a purely four-footed incarnation to make his journey easier. She wasn't in much better shape, devoting her focus mainly to the placing one foot safely and surely before the other. She hadn't been hurt, but she was as exhausted as any of them, and the stresses of the past days were beginning to make their presence felt, oozing through cracks in the walls she'd built to protect her inner self.
According to this story, the weir said to pass the time, the world has two ways of ending, in fire or in ice.
I'm done with endings. I want no more of them, Elora said, refusing to be cheered.
No problem there, Heine.
He caught himself before she could cast a rebuke.
Elora, since you proved yourself so adept at chasing everyone away the one, all that's needed is to banish the other.
I didn't chase anything, you nit. I just talked to them. Despite herself, she flashed a smile of remembrance. I wish you'd seen them as I did. There were so many textures to their flames. It was as if a piece of the sun and the sky had been brought among us and given life.
Who's to say it wasn't?
Who indeed? They weren't. Of us. Do you know what I mean? Not Daikini, not Nelwyn, not Waking World or Veil Folk. We speak so casually of gods and powers, yet when I touched them, I felt a kind of purity that we can't even dream of.
An essence transcending mortal physicality.
You've seen them, she clapped delightedly, losing all her hard-won maturity and reminding them all she was very much only a girl, on the merest cusp of adolescence. You know!
No, perhaps. Seen them, not what you have, nor the way you mean. They're a mystery. That's why the word in this context has a capital. What?
He asked suddenly, at the stark alteration in her expression, as though an inner torch had been doused. You're talking like a tutor.
Knowledge does that. That's the brownies, sterling exceptions that prove the rule.
I don't think so, scoffed Frangine from his perch on Thorn's pouch. All the airs, but none of the learning? Asked Elora. That isn't very nice, or I think very true. And Rule made a very rude gesture he'd picked up on a military parade ground.
Stop a moment, Corey, will you please?
Thorn asked. A moment later, he was riding behind Annelle's eyes, enjoying once more her superb view, even circumscribed as it was by the lowering roof of storm clouds of the world below. There's something about this place, he mused, sharing his thoughts with the great eagle as always. Good? Bad? Indifferent? Not sure. You? I'm definitely good. Beat. When I'm not bad, but indifferent, never. You're developing a far too human sense of humor. Ah, forgive me, Mage. I had no idea humor was the sole prerogative of you two-leg walkers, or, for that matter, what you call humanity. Well, it is, the one anyway. And as for the other, I stand suitably corrected, he sighed, sobriety restored. Not see what you want? Can't see what I want. The perspective's not right. I need more altitude. Not here. Not while that city glows and these winds howl. How bad do you think it is in there, Annelle? Now it was her turn to sigh as she measured the power of her wings against that of the storm. She didn't like the come out wanting, but she liked dissembling less. Frangine says you stink of demon, not because you shared a cage with one. He says the taint's a part of your soul. I can't deny it, much as I'd wish to. Smell much the same to me, old duffer, for what that's worth, but then a key of visuals mainly. Far as Bastion and I are concerned, that wind, that's a demon. It's a whirlpool of air, drawing anything it snares to the heart of that damnable city. We heard some wingborn, and her voice took on a coloration of sorrow, crying as they were swept past, for help, for mercy, for death. Couldn't offer any of it. The vortex sweeps you in, tighter spirals, faster winds, takes all you have just to hold position. Just nothing left to maneuver. Try to go sideways, you end up being swept along until you're right back where you started. You get tired, you lose a little more air. Eventually, there's nothing left, and you're lost. Going to play hell with migrations, Drumheller. This maelstrom lies smack across one of the major flyways. When you and Bastion broke away, when I came to England, did you mark anything of this peak? All who fly the bay mark Doomhall, Drumheller, same as the mariners and seafolk do. It's the clearest landmark on the entire coast. Have you a distinct memory, Enel? May I see? The eagles had been much higher that day, the last full day of sun, and her keen gaze found for him in an instant precisely what he'd been searching for. Thank you, he'd said as he returned wholly to himself, as always, and apologies to the weir from me and Bastion both. He'll be more receptive, I think, when he's fully healed. Fair enough. Blessed bride, he said in a marvel after Corey sent him on the ground, so beside himself he was talking more like Rule. It's no mountain, I mean no natural mountain, it's a fortress. Drumheller, Rin asked incredulously, are you saying somebody made this place? Looks that way, yes. I thought it was a bedtime story. Rin was shaking his head in wonder. Something passed down by the kings in England to make them seem better than they were. Once upon a time, he told them, as they continued on, content for the moment to follow the stag's lead, since he, of them all, appeared to have a destination, gods walked the world. It was a far wilder time, so the story went, and the powers in play more elemental, composed of utterly primal forces. No subtlety to beings or deeds, they displayed a raw, untamed strength that boggled the mind. Wherever they strode, they left their mark. But they were giants in stature, as well as accomplishment, and those who came after too small in every dimension to comprehend the wonders they had wrought. This was one such place. Doomhall Mount, the weir proclaimed. Once the varied, good-natured comments concerned people's stature, or lack thereof, had run their course, seat of the ancient fortress of Angwin. Thorn picked up the tale, relating what he'd seen in the eagle's memories. You can't tell from the ground. Even looking at the mount from out to sea isn't much help because of all the growth that's gone on about it, obscuring the clean lines of the structure. But from the air, from high above, the look of the place suddenly comes apparent. There's a symmetry, you see. The slopes fit too neatly together. They drop too smoothly to the water. Hell's teeth, take the mountain itself. You have to go all the way to the continental spine to find anything near as big. Sure, it looks much the same as the rills and ridges that make up the coastal range, only it's 3 times their size. The stag picked up its step to a faster walk, and they hurried to keep pace as it led them through a series of folds in the rock that turned out to be far wider in actuality than first appearance. The whole mountain was an artful blend of optical illusions, and Thorn grabbed at a firefly of memory, of an early voyage with Malrune, when the big man showed him twists and turns in the rivers where it seemed that the water ahead simply ended. For mile upon mile as they approached, rock walls loomed before them, forming a barrier none could pass, until they found themselves rounding a sharp bend to discover the stream continuing on as broad and powerful as ever. No wall, merely a chimera of the eye, and it was much the same here. Folds in the rocks that, to the distant and casual observer, might be taken for the natural deformations, were transformed on closer scrutiny to passages and sally ports, ramparts that stood so tall they put Sherlindria's woods to shame. Is this a door? Thorn asked in wonderment, bending back so far to see its lintel that he nearly toppled onto his back. No moat, commented Rin, gazing at a parade ground beneath arcing drapes of stone that could hold the whole of the Myzan horde, with room to spare. Of course there's a moat, you lumping ninny of a hairball! Frangine was in rare form. You just call it the bay! How old do you think this place is, Drumheller? Elora asked as they passed within. Frangine beat him to the reply. Rule stayed with the eagles, who, despite their magnificent space, preferred to remain outside, and delighted in it. Might as well ask me, lady, how old the world? As they progressed, earth and floor gave way to flagstones, each spanning greater dimensions than the foundation plan of a good-sized Daikini town and house. Is the whole mountain hollow, do you think? Rin wondered. Very likely. Must be hell to heat. Quite easy, I'd wager, and all eyes went to Corey, as this was the first she'd spoken since coming near the peak. You can feel it in the bedrock stone. Lava streams relatively close beneath the surface. Makes sense, agreed Thorn. Probably thermal springs as well, scattered through the interior. What? Rin exclaimed. Are you saying this is a volcano? All of the assets, none of the liabilities, Thorn told him cheerfully. If it had any tendency toward eruption, I suspect people would have heard by now.
Wouldn't be the first time a builder screwed up his location.
Whoever they were, Taskmanion, they're long gone from this place, from the world.
No offense, Drumheller, but I suggest we follow their example.
Something wrong?
Perhaps I'm like the Eagles. I've never been very comfortable under the roof.
We need the shelter, Rin, and the rest. Our friends didn't bring us here by accident, and he indicated the stag, standing patiently to the side. I'd say, let's have faith in him, as he did in us to save him. He cast his thoughts to Bastion. Weather's lowering. Fair day, wicked night. Have you a place to root? Bastion made a dismissive noise. Not close by, thanks to those fire drakes. Safe haven in a tree places us too far up the coast to do you any decent service. If there's any shelter on these crags, here on Dunhall proper, it's above the cloud line. I can taste the ice forming. We go there, we'll freeze. Doesn't leave much in the way of options. Rule feels much the same. Will you come inside, then? Don't look for us. Trust us to find you. Take care, my friend. Always you the same. He returned to himself to find Corey watching him intently, hunkering down on her heels so they were on the same level. In the distant background, Rin and Elora busied themselves finding fuel for a fire.
The Eagles aren't happy,
Frangine told her, tucking in close to Thorn's side and hoping the information would satisfy the demon child enough to make her stroll away. What's the problem? Or what's your problem? She asked him levelly, at which point the brownie went spectacularly ballistic. A fireworks display of arms and legs and speech all working wildly at once as he charged forward, uncaring of the size differential between them.
You! He squawked. You! I know you for what you are, dissembler, and where you rightly belong, which isn't in the company of decent folks.
Odd, Thorn couldn't resist interjecting. I've heard much the same said about you, Frangine.
Oh!
The brownie turned the most exaggerated look of dismissal on Thorn.
How droll! I'm so struck to the quick.
Would it were so that we might have ourselves a little peace?
You're standing up for this thing?
Cordy is quite capable of standing up for herself, but she's as much my friend as you are, and deserves the same respect and courtesy. The brownie's mouth gaped as he struggled to find an appropriate, preferably lethal rejoinder, gaped wider in appearance like a fish gobbling for food, as nothing came, not the slightest flash of inspiration. His teeth came together with a sharp and resounding clack, and he spun on his heel to stalk stiff-legged away, muttering determinedly that he had no more truck with such foolishness and ingratitude. Why do I suspect that I will pay for this in full measure? What else are friends for, mage? Surprised me, too, saying that, he told her honestly, face turning into a frown that betokened mostly confusion. Did you mean it? Took a deep breath before replying, because he still wasn't wholly sure, and decided in that breath to cast rationality away, as he had with the deer, and let his instinct speak for him. The High Aldwin, he thought, would be proud. Wouldn't have said so otherwise. Since none of the others knew how, Thorn had to light their fire, and in any other venue it would have been a most impressive blaze. But they were crouched in a hearth that stretched wider than a jousting pitch and stood half as high as a cathedral. The chamber itself was beyond superlatives. Elora's eyrie felt far short of the ceiling, and the king's palace could have been lost in a corner. The walls rose in a gentle arch, but the scale of construction was so huge that Thorn couldn't easily tell which elements were due to the ravages of time and which were ornamentation. It was too hard for the eye to wholly encompass the scope. A single glance wouldn't do. Too often, he was forced to scan from side to side to take it all in. He heard a jest from Rin and about what it would take to light the room. One of the towering trees from Shalindria's forest would do nicely, with a fire drake to set its crown alight, but the truth appeared both more prosaic and breathtakingly beautiful. As the comparatively minuscule fire they'd laid in the hearth cast its glow outward, that light was caught by crystalline threads in the very fabric of the rock. This wasn't simply a reflection. The light was somehow absorbed, each thread energized throughout its length in the same way that heat flows down a strand of metal until the entire piece is warm to the touch. The threads cast no direct light, the shadows were still primarily cast from the fireplace, but that was because the source was too weak. For Thorn and his companions, they established a background ambient texture that sparkled like a starlit sky, an ever-changing panoply of color and intensity. Where the hearth in proper use, the room would have been awash in brilliance.
"Hoy, Fray Jean,"
said Rin as Thorn sliced vegetables for cooking. Under the circumstances, with the stag close by, he thought it inappropriate to serve any kind of meat.
"You wee folk are supposed to know all there is."
"About everything worth knowing, yes," the brownie deigned to reply from his distant perch midway up a fireplace cornice.
"Anything about where we are?"
"There's the obvious. The one could fit the whole world of Royal Angwin kitchen into this single hearth.
We know they built big.
Gods didn't like to think about the gods that came before. You Daikini are supposed to have that exclusive market on mortality. And I'm sure," Elora interjected smoothly, "if Rin were Daikini, he'd feel properly humble."
"Ever wonder, though," Rin went on, "about what comes after? In their day, think of those who dwelled here. Were they the ones who made the world? Were they, like, to make their homes of mountains? Where'd they go? How would they feel to be forgotten? How will we when it's our turn?"
"Brownies, cretin, are never forgotten. So long as the memory of one of us lives, so live we all."
"My point exactly. What happens when even their memory dies?"
"Sombre thought, Rin," Thorn said, "for so generally merry a folk."
"It hasn't been a merry few days, Mage. People lived here, now they don't. Same was said of Nockmaar and Tirasleen, and now Angwin. The world turns, but where does it go?"
He shrugged suddenly, disarmingly, disturbingly human in stance and gesture, as though another had stepped forth to live for a time within his skin.
"I swim, I hunt, I play," he said. "I try to do none lasting harm, and think nothing amiss in asking much the same in return. How many folk in that city across the way walk their walking days by the same rules? How many of my brethren will suffer from the storm that killed Morag? Mortal I may be, Peckling,"
and he rounded on Fray Jean as he spoke, with a thread of real anger laced through his words.
"but does that give gods and goddesses the right to rip my life to shreds as though I was no more than a piece on their game board? If they want a war, let them find a place to do it that leaves the rest of us the hell alone."
He finished with a shout that boomed and echoed off the stone rafters and took a long time to fade away. "Bavmorda was no god," Thorn said simply. "She was a woman with tainted dreams, and the desire and ability to make them real, and for all the fanfare, Elora's no god either." "No god," the girl said, trying for humor but coming up short because her description of herself was what she believed to be the truth. "No dreams, no desire, no ability."
"I don't know,"
Rin continued helplessly, waving away the plate of food Thorn offered and a cup of steaming broth as well, while he paced back and forth before the fire, as though he were in a cage.
"I've heard the stories of this Bavmorda was such an abomination. Why'd the great powers have to drag that Nelwyn into it? What's his name?"
"Willow Ufgood," Elora told him softly, and then, more softly still, her memory of the tower haunting her features, fading the rich dark blue of her eyes, which turned inexorably toward Thorn. "My protector."
"Why any need for a sacred princess at all? Why didn't they simply slap Bavmorda down and have done with it?"
"Why not ask them yourself?" Thorn said, draining the last of his own cup. Rin looked puzzled a moment before noticing that Thorn was looking past him, as was Corey. Even Fray Jean had fallen silent. Only Elora stared into the heart of the flames, as though she might find the transcendence she'd touched oh so briefly within the fire drakes, paid not the slightest heed. The great vaulting hall was empty no longer. Throughout their trek up from the beach, they'd remarked on the emptiness of the forest. Not an animal to be seen or heard, as though none had ever been. Now they knew why. All stood before them, from the smallest bugs and lizards to full-grown mountain cats and highland rams. Birds and beasts together, hunters and prey, amongst their own kind or mixed in with others, some standing alone, others with families clustered close by, the very old and barely born. They stood and stared with an air of patient expectation, and the thought came to Thorn that he had come into some fantastical court with this multitude the jury. Dead center, in the room, in the gathering, was the stag, and as Thorn rose to his feet and started forward, so did he. only the beast's aspect changed with every deliberate step. Flesh and sinew running like wax or mercury, turning him into a fox and owl and raven and mouse and spider, so that by the time he finally came to stand before the Nelwyn, he had manifested the form of every creature present, including, at the last, a passable imitation of a daikini. He was tall, and he'd seen better days. The one constant throughout his ongoing metamorphosis was the legacy of his burns, and in each instance he wore them as a badge of honor. The hair of his head had been reduced to scrappy stubble, his beard the same. The day's travel had weathered his skin some, but it still possessed the roseate pink of a baby's flesh, and he held himself as though the very touch of the air was an irritation. He still wore horns, though not so huge on a human head as when he was a stag. They formed a sleek curve up and back from the flanks of his skull, each with 3 nasty sharp points.
"Why?"
he demanded without preamble or introduction. "I don't know," was all the answer Thorn could find.
"This was a blessed place,"
the man said, his voice as raw as his flesh, and there was a pain in it that had nothing to do with his words.
"All live within peace and harmony."
"I know, I'm sorry."
"The balance is broken. The land screams because its spirit is no more."
He saw Sherlindria as silver in her way as Elora had become. That glow dulled, the bright glory of her eyes as ensnared by the deceiver's lies as her body was by his web of evil. "We are all of the world," Thorn said, with a passion on his own. "In our way, we have all suffered, but we survive, we persevere, as Frangine said about his own folk. So long as one of us lives, there is hope. From that hope, rebirth."
"Words!"
the stag lord shrieked, hand flashing up and down faster than the eye could follow, changing as it swept across Thorn's face to grow a brace of claws in place of fingers. He felt a sting and saw blood fly, but otherwise took no notice of the strike as the stag lord raised his hand, truly a human hand once more, as normal in appearance as Thorn's own, to show its scarlet fingertips to the assemblage.
"Is that what you'd prefer?"
he asked the taller man, after quelling Corey with a silent gesture. She crossed almost the whole distance to him, starting the instant the stag lord raised his hand, gathering speed with every loping step in a charge that would have ended with her plunging past him, her sword slicing across him level with his shoulders to claim his head and into the heart of the gathering beyond. "That there be war where once was peace?" Thorn continued, without making any effort to stem the flow of blood down his slashed cheek. If the stag lord was bothered by Corey's aborted attack, as Tasmanian placed himself bodily in her way and pressed her gently, insistently, inexorably back toward the wall, it didn't show.
"If such is your hope,"
the stag lord replied,
"it comes too late."
and a rustle of agreement made its way across the assemblage. "We come as friends."
"What was once given freely, manling, must now be earned."
He thrust out his right arm, and Thorn's blood leapt forth from outstretched fingers, becoming the rough braided body of a whip to rake diagonally across Elora's back from shoulder to hip.
"If you would regain your rightful place among us," the stag lord thundered, "you must prove yourselves worthy."
This time his cry was echoed by a susurrus of voices from the assemblage, redolent with a rage and a hunger for vengeance that allowed little chance for mercy. The fire was blazing more brightly, far beyond the capacity of the combustibles that have been found for it, reaching up and outward to the side as though the hearth were remembering the way things were when it was young as well used. Too late, Thorn saw that Elora sat too close. He couldn't go to her. He dared not turn his back to the stag lord, sensing he'd be impaled with a brace of steps, but aware as well that it was too hot for Rin or Corey to try either. The whip slash left a wicked trail across her shirt, and should have cut her to the bone, but as they watched, the stain faded away until there wasn't a mark on her shirt. The cloth was as pristine as when it first was woven, and by implication, the skin beneath as well.
"She is the great betrayer,"
accused Sherlindria's forest consort, taking her immunity to his attack as proof positive of his indictment. "Not so," denied Thorn with passion to match.
"All came to pay her homage."
"And were deceived, as was she."
"More words."
"True words.
Spoken by you who would say anything to save her.
I saved you!
And that has earned you the right to be heard and judged fairly.
The blood whip came now for him, his vision flooding scarlet as tendrils stabbed through his eyes and poured fury into every particle of his body. The stag lord thrust himself forward, hands grasping Thorn beneath the armpits and lifting him high overhead until he was poised on the tips of the man's horns. The energies of the blood whip arced around and through them both, spread eagling Thorn and stretching his extremities to their utmost until joints began to pop from their sockets. His mouth had likewise gone wide as flesh would allow, teeth bared to such an extent he thought all the component parts of him would tear apart. His expression twisting into a rictus of unbearable agony that he knew was but a fraction of what the stag lord had endured running through the fire. He and the stag lord had shared blood. Now they shared life, the skeins of their past rising from every orifice right down to the pores of their skin. And Thorn found himself in the depths of the primeval wood, moving with stately grace on four-hooved feet, secure in his speed and strength, and the deadly prongs that tipped his antlers to keep him safe. Wherever Sherlindria had a grove, there was he able to roam, moving with the ease of thought from one to another regardless of the distance between them. On solstice and equinox, he and his lady met for a moonlit dance, casting through a myriad of forms in celebration of the diversity of life within their realm. Sprites and fairies streaked the air with rainbows that were in turn lit from within by an array of cascading sparkles, creating the same riotous patterns of glittering diamonds that could be seen watching the moon cast its glow across the ocean surface. Even in the depth of winter, their bower was bedecked with garlands, and from the elemental passions of their love came a surge of renewal for both the woodland and the creatures who dwelled within. When Sherlindria was ensorcelled, it was as though the heart had been cut from both her consort and the land he nurtured. It had been a struggle to shift halfway across the world to this grove, and he arrived to find the fire drakes already at work. He wasted no time, but rushed to the defense of its inhabitants. There had been none of the Vale folk to rescue. Trees were empty of dryads, ponds and streams of nymphs. No elves or fairies, no pixies nor nixies, brownies or trolls. Only the denizens of the waking world and those he herded with increasingly reckless desperation to the hoped-for refuge of ancient Angwin. The fire drakes tried to stop him, for the sport of living prey excited them even more than the joy they found in simple burning, but here his strength stood him in good stead. And to the surprise of the elemental fire creatures, his rack proved as formidable against them as any corporeal foe. But the woods about him had become a hollow place, bereft of any aspect of the divinity he worshipped, and far poorer for the loss of her. He wasn't the first to share her arbor. His desperate fear was that he would be the last. Thorn cried, each word a hoarse shout like a man uttering his last testament. Fight for what I believe!
And what is that, manling?
Pain vanished. With it, all support, as the stag lord cast him to the stone floor. He'd been pulled so taut that nothing about his body felt like it fit together any longer. Not jaw, not teeth. Sentences emerging as though he had marbles in his mouth. Elora Danan spoke for your life, he said from all fours, as though he were the beast here. Doesn't that count for something?
You speak with passion for the betrayer, mortal. Say you nothing for yourself?
She's no more your betrayer than I am.
Have a care lest you condemn yourself.
Slain by friends or foe, the end's the same. I'm sorry for the damage that's been done here, but you're not the first to suffer so, nor, heaven have mercy, the last, and for a certainty nowhere near among those who've suffered worst. I don't know why the patterns have been broken. Perhaps there was necessary to reform them in a new and better way, but it's done. Wish all you please for something different. The world is as it is. We have to make the best of it. For myself, that means I'll fight. For Elora Danan against the deceiver. You've seen my heart. And he regained his feet to confront the stag lord full in the face, as though there was no longer a size difference between them. Both when I healed you and now with this judgment, and through me, my friends. That is truth. We are not your enemies, Lord, and that child is all the hope of the world.
How noble a sentiment, Peck!
intruded the deceiver's voice, too familiar by half, the sound of it stabbing at Thorn like a dagger as resonant here as it had been in Elora's tower. At the same moment, a shape flashed past the corner of Thorn's vision, and he sprang toward it seconds too late to catch Bastion and Enel before the eagle's broken bodies, bound cruelly in a barbed capture net, bounced on the flagstones. He had his knife out by the time they had reached his friends, and he used a dollop of power to add keenness to the blade, strength to his swing as he slashed at the mesh. All he saw was blood and the eagle's rapidly dimming eyes. All he could think of was the anguish of losing another that he loved, and how much their strength was needed for this coming battle. He never stopped to consider why he felt no hint of any attack over the link he shared with the two great raptors. If not from them, then surely from Rule. He saw what he was supposed to see, out of fatigue, out of fear, out of love. He never turned to insight to make sure it was real. Too late, as he touched the net, he realized he'd been tricked, and the sight before him an intentionally cruel illusion. The strands flowed out and up over him, the barbs reversing themselves to stab through clothes and skin and fill him with a poison that numbed his limbs and flooded him with an agony that far surpassed even what the Stag Lord had just put him through. In the meantime, the eagles' forms altered as well, legs and necks elongating, bills stabbing outward into something best remembered as rapier, bodies swelling to twice their original size, with wings whose span surpassed the height of a tall daikini. At first look, night herons appeared black, but it was really the darkest of blues, noticeable only as highlights at the tips of their feathers, or when sun firelight touched them just so. Their accent colors were an equally dusky red. They were the essence of sorcerous power cast into a semblance of flesh. One of the pair stooped for the Stag Lord, who used his whip to fair effect, raking it across the body of the creature. The heron staggered in flight, a raw lesion opening across its breast, but the blow had taken all that remained of the whip's power, and it sizzled into nothingness in the Stag Lord's grasp. He'd meant it only as a delaying tactic, however, and took the moment's grace to shift back to his cervine form. Without the slightest hesitation, he stabbed forward, reaching the heron across the throat with crown and royal antlers before finishing the job with his brow set in a lifting strike that opened the predator from abdomen to throat. He bellowed his challenge as he cast the already decaying carcass aside, but the triumph was brutally short-lived as he reared up on his hind legs to rally all his domain. He was struck from every side by so many crossbow quarrels that it seemed that one appalling instant as though he'd been turned into a living pincushion. His legs collapsed as he landed, folding at knees and shoulder and sending him crashing partially to the ground before Thorn, who fought against his own bounds in a futile attempt to go to the stag's aid. Somehow, the beast twisted to a foot into place and began to struggle upright. There was a tumult toward the rear of the huge chamber, and a pair of horses burst into view, one black, the other white, the same color as their riders. The woman reined in her mare as the scene came fully into view, but her companion spurred her own mount into a full charge, sending animals scrambling frantically from his path. Some snarled defiance, a very few made reflexive moves to attack, but snipers from hidey holes scattered high along the walls cut them down with ease. Panic swept the assemblage with the consuming ferocity of a wildfire, and here and there, across the vast space of some of the animals, broke for freedom. Thorn was bawling defiance. It was all he could do, make these idiot sounds. The poison had severed the linkages between mind and voice, stripping him of the ability to express himself with any coherence. The Stag Lord knew what was coming, and he was determined not to be found wanting. The Castellan leveled his spear, his stallion eating the distance between them. It seemed so easy. The stag stood much as he had atop the reef, legs splayed, chest heaving, only in this instance, each pump of his heart sent another helping of his life pouring through a skin festooned with iron quills. There was blood on his muzzle and streaming from his mouth, together with a crimson froth that meant his lungs had been punctured. He was angled away from his attacker, preferring in the last moment to share his glance with Thorn. There was no regret in his dark eyes, only a grim anticipation. At the moment of contact, the Stag Lord spun with speed and strength that none suspected were left in him. The spear was bang on target, punching through the solid bone of the beast's shoulder, though through both lungs and the noble beast's indomitable heart. Simultaneously, though, the stag raked its crown the length of the horse's flank. The stallion screamed like a woman, a high-pitched ululation that resounded through the hall, freakishly gaining in intensity before it began to fade away. There was a cry from the castellan as well as the animal reared and pitched itself aside, allowing no chance for its rider to leap free before crashing down atop him. It was as though that fall was a signal. The archers laid down an indiscriminate fire as quickly as they could reload, choosing what they saw as the most dangerous targets among the gathering, namely the great fanged predators. But neither cats nor wolves, nor anyone else for that matter, stayed still to be massacred. The whole floor began to move in every conceivable direction, as though it were a pool of water suddenly unleashed down an open drain. Through that living chaos surged the Princess Anacre, urging her mare with more care than the castellan had shown, but no less determination, reaching him more quickly than any of his men. The stag-lord was dead, as was the horse, and Anacre's ragged cries were unheard at first, amidst the howling, rolling cacophony of roars, yips, squeals, squawks, and chitters, not to mention the scrabble of every kind of foot upon the stone, as all animals fled. And the more the occasional scream as each side took its toll of the other. Stillness returned to the room without warning. Looking about herself, Anacre could see a fair shake of bodies, but less than nothing compared with the multitude that had been, and she couldn't help but shudder at the memory of the exodus of animals from England only a few nights before. "I need a healer!" she roared again, hooking her arms beneath the Myzan's shoulders and bracing a foot against his saddle, the better to heave him free. He was a mess, one leg slashed multiple times to the bone, a wicked gash along his flank as well, so sodden with blood that she was sure a major vessel had been severed, while the other leg was visibly broken above and below the knee. She stripped a belt from her harness, wrapped it tight around his thigh, as snug to the crotch as it would go, then twisted it again and again until the pulsing stream slowed to the merest trickle. "Damn you, Peck!" she snarled at Thorn, making no attempt to hide the raw fury on her face. "For what you've done!"
"No fear, my dear," called the deceiver from the hearth. "'Twill soon turn out all right."
"Mordry's dying, wizard! Can you do something about that?"
"At the moment, regretfully, no," the deceiver said.
Thorn cursed the fact that he was draped away from the hearth, with no idea of what was happening there. The poison had crippled his insight. He couldn't see through his friend's eyes. It had been years since he'd last been head-blind, and it wasn't a treat.
"But your Peck's the healer. Brought Stag and Wheel both back from the brink. Make him an offer he can't refuse. I'm sure he'll see his way clear to offer you similar service."
She took Thorn by his bonds, hauling him hard and high, ignoring the grimaces as its barbs stabbed him. "Fair deal, Peck," she said. "The castellan's life for yours." He wanted to ask why she cared so much for someone who had to be her deadly enemy, and ask as well what force her pledge had in a room full of Myzan. So it was probably for the best that he couldn't say a word. Instinct once more spoke for him, with the only movement he could manage the barest nod of his head. Once released, he tried to take a moment on the floor to gather his wits, but a rough hand grabbed him by the scruff and set him upright. It was Garin Havelhand, in the leathers of a captain of the Red Lions. Corey and Taskmanion had been separated and moved to opposite ends of the great fireplace, there lashed in place against the massive andirons and watched by guards with ready swords. Elora hadn't moved from where she knelt before the fire, only now that blaze stretched from one end of the hearth to the other, the tips of its flames vanishing above the lintel. Before her, in the heart of the inferno, stood the deceiver. As tall as before, as beautiful, the picture-perfect hero, and yet, to Thorn's eye, there were pieces missing. A softening around the edges as though the figure were somehow losing definition, the way an object might look to some with weak eyes. Thorn's were perfect, bless his powers. The wrongness wasn't his, but the deceiver's. His eyes looked a fraction more hollow, as did the drape of skin below his cheekbones, and the skin itself had lost a measure of resilience. whatever had happened since the area had visibly diminished him.
For what it's worth, Nelwyn, the deceiver said, I meant nothing for none of this. I meant for none of this.
Is this some plea for absolution? He spoke slowly, rounding his words as though he had trouble speaking. Am I supposed to care?
Always you judge me,
the face remaining no less perfect in fury, and he understood his foe meant more by always than these past days. Another piece for his mosaic, making no more sense than the rest.
As the Staglord did you. Have a care lest you share his fate as well.
Then calm returned. The mask slipped once more back into place.
Do your work, little sorcerer, the deceiver said dismissively, while I do mine.
Thorn turned to Anacary. Let Elora Danan go. I'll save your prince.
Waste of breath, Peck,
the deceiver said over its shoulder, throwing the words directly into Thorn's mind where no one else could hear them.
She's not the power here.
What's this, then? Thorn asked of Garin as he was escorted to the fallen warrior.
I'm a soldier of the king. I swore an oath,
the lad replied proudly, as if that explained all. And you? What's your excuse? He demanded of the princess as she unlaced Modri's helm. Garin cuffed him soundly.
She's Princess Royal, he admonished. And you keep a respectful tongue in your head, Peck, or suffer for it.
I'm Princess Royal of the realm, Anacary replied with a formality of speech Thorn hadn't expected, at odds with her brusque, matter-of-fact battlefield manner. And I, too, swore an oath. She pulled Modri's helm free, and therein, Thorn thought, lay perhaps part of the answer. It was a haunting face, defined by planes and angles so sharp they might have been cut by a master stonemason, as many edges to his features as to his personality in feature. In body, here was a man distilled to his quintessence, pale of skin, with hair of white gold, as little color to his eyes, even allowing for the significant loss of blood. He's not good enough for you, he thought, shifting his gaze from one to the other and wondering if Anacary read that in his face, because she flushed and turned her hawk-like gaze away. But I can see why you might think otherwise. Because for all the cruelty and calculation that swam in the turbulence of the Castellan spirit, there was also true feeling, a regard for this woman, possibly even love. That surprised the Maizan above all. Please, she said, and he knew it cost her to say so. He's dying.
Stop stalling, Peck,
snapped Garin with a not-so-gentle clout to the shoulder,
and you'll not be bleeding these.
With a thrusting twist of his short sword, he severed Thorn's belt and quickly sidekicked the pouches out of reach. No matter. Thorn's offside hand came out of his vest pocket, closed about a pair of acorns, one for each of them, followed by a solid punch to shatter them to bits. He'd kept them as keepsakes, to remind him of a time when both the power and the ability of a sorcerer were still mostly dreams, but they served a practical purpose as well. The acorns were a very basic magic, not the sort of thing any foe worth their name would expect. For the same reason, he practiced his old sleight of hand tricks. Every scrap of knowledge, no matter how seemingly trivial, was an asset, never to be discarded, because a body never knew when it might come in handy. Unfortunately, he had no idea what to do with the snipers, or the guards watching Quarry or Rin, or most especially, how to deal with the deceiver. His only certainty was that once he began his work on the Castellan, Elora was doomed. I'm glad you found your heart's desire, Garin, he said. I pray this lays your ghosts to rest. The Daikini's blade lightly touched his lips.
No sweet words, Peck, Thorn was warned, lest you lose your tongue. Speak 'em, get my meaning?
It's your destiny, Elora Danan, he heard in his mind from the hearth, and knew the spell of dissolution was once more being woven. To reach out your hand across the domains and know your will is law. That's not so horrible a thing, to wipe away hatred, fear, greed. They are prideful folk. They require strong will to master them. Not yours, I'm sorry to say, and there was true regret in the words, but every prize of value has its price. Thorn couldn't help himself. He turned and saw the two figures separated by a boundary of cold flame. The deceiver had a small advantage of height on Elora, though in manner he seemed much taller, with a commanding presence that matched the Castellan's. His hand was outstretched, his body curved forward along the back in eager anticipation, Elora's matching him in every gesture, every expression. Fire rippled in the deceiver's grasp and leapt across to hers. "I won't beg, Nelwyn," said the princess, "but I won't let Modred die unavenged." He faced her. "That's not salvation happening over there, Highness. It's doom." All right, and that is going to be all the time that I have today to read Shadow Moon by Chris Claremont and George Lucas. Thank you for spending part of your day with me. If you enjoyed this reading, please like, share, and subscribe for more Willow content. You can also support the channel by becoming a patron on Patreon or a member here on YouTube. Your support helps us keep the magic alive. Thank you, creator patron Aaron Hardy and developer patron Chris Androu. Until the Infernal Brotherhood convenes again, my fellow scruffy-looking nerf herders, may the Force be with you.